What is going on? It is Nate the Game Guy coming back with another video at hand, and today I want to talk to you guys about consoles that I may have neglected. Now, as you guys already know, I am a huge game collector and I am very passionate about the hobby. However, there are times where I will walk through my game room and I'll walk by a shelf or two and I'll sometimes think to myself, wow, this is such an awesome console. Like, I need more games for it. And even though these are consoles that I really love, I just feel that I may have neglected them just simply because that, I feel like I should have more games for them, just because either because I really like the consoles overall, or there are just some games on these consoles that I just, I think I should have. In this video, I plan to go over a few consoles that I think I may have neglected, go over some of my thoughts, some of my reasons to it, and also show you guys as to which consoles I'm talking about, as to where they are displayed in the game room. So without further ado, let's dive right into this video subject, take a look at some neglected consoles of mine when it comes to my overall game collection, right after the intro. Alrighty, so I want to start things off pretty strong by talking about multiple consoles at once, but to be more specific, talk about multiple handhelds at once. And that is the Game Boy handhelds. The Game Boy handhelds are loved by many. I've known so many people personally growing up that did not grow up with Nintendo home consoles such as 64, GameCube, Super Nintendo, all that, but they still had Game Boys. Of course, Game Boys had so many great games. We're talking about the Pokemon games, Super Mario Land, Legend of Zelda, Link in the Minish Cap, among so many other great games on these handhelds. Of course, when I do go through my game room, sometimes I will look at my relatively small Game Boy collections for my OG Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, and sometimes I really think to myself, I'm like, wow, I should have way more games than this for my Game Boy consoles, right? And I think to me that I've just not really been proactive when it's come to collecting for Game Boy. It's just simply because for a very long time over the years, I wanted to have everything complete in box, and I do have some complete in box Game Boy Advance games. However, as the years went on and I really began to think about things with some of my collecting goals, the way that I play my games and all that, I finally decided that one day that it just simply did not make sense for me to collect complete in box for a lot of cartridge based consoles. I'm not going to go into all of my specific reasons in this video as to why I made that decision, but instead I'll link a video right here that you guys can check out where I do talk more about my thought process as to why I decided not to collect a lot of cartridge-based consoles complete in box. And you'll notice that this is a theme that does occur pretty often in this video, so I won't talk about it a lot. It's just because I've already mentioned it here. So once I do talk about some more cartridge-based consoles, you will already know the reason why as to why I don't have very many games for some of these consoles, and why some of them I don't even have games complete in box for them. But overall, I will say I do feel that my Game Boy collections are relatively neglected. After all, so many great games. That is a personal goal of mine for the game room, is to try to beef up the Game Boy collections at some point or another, because there are so many great games on the Game Boy consoles, and I just gotta fix that. Now, another neglected console that I do want to talk about in the game room is the Super Nintendo. Now, currently I have 51 Super Nintendo games. Granted, not all of them are placed right here on this exact shelf, but the majority of my Super Nintendo collection is placed right here. Now, Just like the Game Boy, I was contemplating to basically get every Super Nintendo game complete in box. Again, I won't go into the details about that right here, but I will say on the flip side of things, when it comes to the Super Famicom, which is the Japanese equivalent of the Super Nintendo, all the games that I want for it are complete in box, with a few exceptions. Interestingly, I've got a book off near me, and they do sell some Super Famicom games there. And since the games were so ridiculously cheap, at least the ones that I want to play for, right? I do have 2 copies of a few games on the Super Famicom. I've got my complete in box copies that, are just going to be hanging out on the shelf. And then, of course, I've got some loose copies, which are going to be the games that I will play when I feel like playing them. It was pretty cool just because to me it was just like some hanging fruit. So I was just like, yeah, since these are so cheap, why not? But normally that's not something that I do with my collection. But I will say when it comes to the Super Nintendo collection, there are some games on the Super Nintendo I really want to add to some point. After all, Chrono Trigger, Mega Man X2 and X3, among so many other great games on the Super Nintendo. The Super Nintendo is easily one of my favorite consoles from the 90s. And I gotta say, this is a console that I really do want to beef up the collection as time goes on with my game collecting journey. Now, another awesome 90s video game console that I do feel is pretty neglected here in the game room is the Sega Genesis. Now, as you guys can tell, with the Sega Genesis, I have completely different collecting goals for it than compared to the Super Nintendo and the Game Boy handhelds. With my Sega Genesis games, I want to get them all complete in box. And of course, the Sega Genesis has so many great games on it. After all, we're talking about the Sonic games, the Streets of Rage games, Golden Axe, Altered Beast, so many great games on the Sega Genesis. This is a console I really want to beef up the collection with. I feel like I have a pretty decent size already. Decent, not great, but unfortunately I do feel like my selection is not really the greatest. There's a lot of sports games in my Genesis collection that I'm just not really thrilled to play like anytime soon, if at all. And there's just so many great Genesis games that I want to add. After all, I want to finish all the other Sonic games to add to the collection. I want to get the Streets of Rage games, Bonanza Brothers, Alien Storm, along with so many other great games on the Genesis. That is certainly going to be a goal of mine within the future, is try to beef up the collection for the Genesis, make it bigger, get some better games in there and all that. I don't really have any games that I would necessarily consider bad, but like I said, I'm just not really a fan of sports games in general. So I do want to add some more killer and have less filler in the collection. So I gotta say, I do feel like the Genesis is pretty neglected, so definitely gotta fix that within the future. Of course, still sticking to the theme of the 90s, I want to talk about my Nintendo 64 collection. Now, as you guys can see right behind me, I have my complete in-box Nintendo 64 collection. You guys already got a glimpse of a few of my loose Nintendo 64 games when I showed you some of my Super Nintendo games from earlier. I truly love the Nintendo 64. It was the very first game console that I ever owned, and there are so many great games for the Nintendo 64. It is actually a personal goal of mine in the game room to get the entire Nintendo 64 set, North American of course, into the game room at some point. I love the Nintendo 64, and as you guys can tell, there was a point where I was trying to get all my Nintendo 64 games to be complete in box. But after thinking about over a few things over the years, obviously I changed my mind. Of course, I'm still going to keep the complete in box games of the Nintendo 64 still complete in box. And of course, what's really nice is if I ever decide to change my mind later at some point and get every game I own to be complete in box, I could always just buy the box, the manual separately off of eBay later down the line. But I definitely will say I wish I started things off way sooner with collecting my Nintendo 64 games loose, because I do feel like I would have a much bigger Nintendo 64 collection right now. After all, collecting complete in box for some of these cartridge-based consoles is much more expensive than collecting loose. Not exactly the main reason as to why I stopped collecting complete in box for these cartridge-based consoles, but I will say if I only collected loose from the very beginning, I really do feel like I would have a much bigger Nintendo 64 collection. After all, there's so many great games on it. I want to grab the Mario Party games, right? I want to get the rest of the Turok games, and there are just so many other great games on the 64 I gotta add to my collection. So that's just another console that I gotta fix things up just a little bit in the game room as the years go by. Now, I'm sure at this point in the video, I'm sure you guys will not be surprised at all when I say this console, I do believe, is neglected in the game room, and that is the NES. Now, right here are not all of my NES games, but here are a few of my favorite games that I have for the NES. Now, currently with me, I'm not showing all of my NES games right now. It's just simply because I'm doing some rearranging in the game room at the moment, and it would just not really be convenient for me to show off all of my NES games. But I'm sure that will easily change in the future. But I do have to say, just like the Super Nintendo, Nintendo 64, the Game Boy handhelds, all that same complete in box mindset applies to the NES games, and I do want to beef up the NES collection. After all, it's my favorite game console from the 80s. After all, so many great games, and Nintendo launched so many great IPs on this console. The Legend of Zelda games, Super Mario, Metroid, among so many other great games that aren't just Nintendo related, but are also third-party IPs as well that are also great, such as the Mega Man games, right? So many great games on the NES. Got to change that in the future. Of course, as the years will go by, you guys will be able to track me as I go along, beefing up some of these neglected handhelds and consoles to have better sizable collections within the game room, or at least I'll certainly try to make it better, right? And I do have to say, yeah, gotta beef up the NES set, all that wonderful stuff. Like I said, easily my favorite console from the 80s. Just gotta do things right and beef it up. So yeah, stick around and stay tuned. Hey guys, thank you so much for checking out my video. Please be sure to check out these videos here, and here. After all, I post a lot of content when it comes to game collecting tips, and other video game related subjects. So be sure to keep an eye out every Monday and Friday where I upload consistently, and I'll be seeing you guys next time.